And we continue learning Dirshu Mishnah Brura, as will be B'siyata de Shemaya, concluding Siman Kof Ayin Zayin, as we pick it up from Sif Gimel. Says the Machaber in Sif Gimel, Ve'im Kaiveya Lifton Seudasai Al HaPeiros. If you're Kaiveya, you're Lifton to have a meal with fruit. Havle Peiros Kedvar Mabah Machmas HaSeudah. Then the fruit has a din of part of the meal. Even if you eat from the pears at the beginning of the meal, without bread, still you don't make a bracha before or afterwards. And some disagree. And therefore, what should he do? We have a machlaikas whether these peiros have a din of machmas hasuda, whether they require a bracha. Says the Mechaber, what you should do is you should begin by making a bracha on the peiros with bread. Then even if afterwards you eat some of them without the bread, they still don't require a bracha at all. So you have to start off eating them a little bit with bread. Then, even if afterwards you don't, that's going to be fine. Concludes the Ramah. Even though at the end you don't necessarily have bread with them. Once the ikr kviyas was with the bread, then that's going to be fine. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if God tesvav, v'im kaiveya ratzaleimar shekviyas yudazalav izabasei rak elu apeiros. The entirety of your Seudah was these peiros. And therefore, not that you happen to have fruit, not that the fruit will be some level part of the meal. No, your fruit are your meal. You're having bread and fruit, and you're eating it together with the bread. That's when we have this shayla. But even on such a scenario, why? Because this sheet holds, if Lamaisa at the beginning you have some of these items without bread, Lamaisa, they don't become part of the meal. Because you have a bite of this apple or whatever this fruit is, to start the meal without bread, you need a bracha on it. Simchat Yutain, Vav will be me'acher. And this was the Ramah. The Ramah said, even though at the end of the meal, you don't go back and have with bread again at the end of the meal, since you started the meal with this item, it's okay. Ratzalaimer says the Mishnah Berurah. Even though in Sif Aleph we said that you need to have only time to pater up in such a scenarios if you have the bread both at the beginning and at the end of with the item. In our case, that the ikr of the meal is only on these fruits. Therefore, you're able to continue eating them without a bracha, even though you're not going to continue eating them with bread. So because there's such a kaviyas, in such a scenario, the Ramah is going to be willing to allow you to pater and not make a bracha on this item, even if you just start with the bread, even though you don't have every single bite, and even though you don't conclude and have them with the bread. Continues the Machaber, Sif Dalit. Even though the fruit is not in front of you, even the lav is in the pasim boim, since they're there for the bread, you don't need a bracha at all. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if got in your ches, shelo yahayu. Even you have explicit minds. Because you're being kaveh yourself for a meal. So your mindset is for the meal, and therefore, even if you don't have explicit for this fruit, that is the Seudah, therefore they are pater. Bracha klaus of kati yotas pure. So masha echalim abas, masha echabloy bas. That's going to go back to what we saw in the previous sifim. And we continue with Sif Hey. Says the Machaber, after you made a bracha on the bread, they send you from other houses. You didn't have any mind for this present. Even items that are normal with bread. You didn't know about them. You got to make a bracha. Says the Ramav, I never saw people nizar with this. The time with the stam das Adam, maybe because the stam das of a person is like kol ma'ashavin lo b'sudah b'ayil like one seven rishvav, which we're seeing how far the stam das of a person could go. If we're saying that the stam das of a person could go even for items that were not really in your mindset, and you did not have in mind to eat them, but still, because at some level you have some level of das that maybe they're going to come, etc., etc. The Ramah says perhaps that is the reason why people are not makbid to make a bracha on them. We continue with the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkot and Chaf, Shedar Kanavai, Ratzalaymar, says the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, and you can eat them with the bread. Excuse me, and you do eat it with the bread, but since it comes from another house, for example, your neighbor knocks on your door in the middle of a meal and hands you, you want to bite them, or you want to try my challenge, you want to have a little bit of steak, etc. Since it comes from a different house and you don't have mindset, says the Mechaber, they're not nifter with the bracha and the bas. I'll call mas and cut the chavalf. But then said the Ramah, Lamaisa, we don't find people who are makbid on this. The Ramah suggests that maybe the reason is that the stam das b'nei Adam is anything that comes during the meal. Sivkat el chavalf. V'hainu, kshe'eviu lo yidvarim habayim machzas Seudah. Chnav savalf. Reminds the Ramah, but it's only going to work if it's something that has something to do with the meal. Certainly, if it's something, it's a dessert type of item, certainly it's not going to work. So before we finish, the Mishnah over here has a little bit of a sikum in which he wraps up the dina that we've been learning. Let's just see two short Dirshus over here. Dirshu number 23 says, regarding a chayla that needs to eat. And we're going to say that on it's in Reish Ches, bottom levarich aleim, you don't have to make a bracha during the meal. Since he's a chayla, and he needs shkedim. So even though shkedim are not a meal food, because he's eating it for his refuah, his ikr, his kviyas Seudah is on them, and therefore you don't make a bracha on it. One who has a banana in the middle of a meal, without any bread, and it's considered part of the meal, says Moshe Sternbach, the Chazon Ish did not make a bracha on the banana. What's the reason? Because in such a scenario, the banana was the ikr of the Seudah, of course. We're talking about a case in which, of course, he's talking about a case that you're having a banana in the middle of the meal, you're just not eating it with the bread. But if that is your meal, Senator Moshe Sternbach said you don't have to make a bracha on it. So we've got Dirshu number 24. The reason over here is because all these items are considered tafel to the bread. Therefore, you need to make a bracha on them. Not like the Aruch HaShulchan that says you're eating it with bread, it's pattered with the bracha. And again, finally, Dirshu number 25 is only if they bring you food type of items during the meal. However, this then is not knowing only b'mekaimais of derech shchenim or kroivim to bring food one to another. But if that's not normal, and just randomly once in a blue it happens, says the Aruch HaShulchan, you have to make a bracha on it. Similarly, the Lavosh, Shulchan Harav, the Tila David, they say the same. Tila David says, that which Ramah says, you don't have to make a bracha, because Seudah Kavua, you're tied to anything you're going to bring to them. So basically what's coming out over here is, and maybe we can differentiate in the Balabatishkeit of where one lives, maybe it's more similar that if someone lives in a apartment building, then we could suggest that maybe it's more common that an able to bring over food or whatnot. And again, I don't think it has anything to do with the apartment building per se. It is as the Aruch HaShulchan, the Graz just pointed out to us, it's balabatish. It's dependent upon, is there some level of norm that someone will bring you something during the meal? Meaning, even within the stam das of the Ramah, that the Ramah is teaching us that, what do you mean? People bring things in the middle of the meal, but we're seeing over here that the Paiskim, the Achreinim are clarifying it has to have some level of das. If it's never happened and it's the first time ever that your neighbor brings you over something, in that scenario, it would be very shver to be mekel. Let's finish off over here with the Mishnah Berurah. He writes, Kitzer, Dine Peiros, Habayim, Machmas, Seudah, to wrap up this siman. Im oichalim abas, eat the peiros with the bread, pshita shein zarech klal bracha, you don't need a bracha. Why? Dinas tafel abas, because then it is part of the bread, which, by the way, right there, that really answers half the question. That if you're having something with the bread, then you're fine. And this, of course, is going to be the eight. So that any time there's going to be a suffix, what do? You have it with the bread. What does it mean with the bread? With the bread mamish. You have the bite of the apple together with the bite of the challah, and then it's not something one has to worry about. But says Mishmura, even if they're cooked. Now it's interesting, very strong lashon Mishnah Berurah that it's pashit. You have cooked fruit. It's not part of the meal. It's a dessert. You make a brach. Now let's say you want to have part with bread, part without bread. Therefore, says Mishnah Berurah, it says the Mishnah Berurah, this is only when you're having a meal with other items. Like we saw today at the end of the siman. So the Mishnah Berurah definitely sounds conclusive that there would be a bracha on dessert type of foods. Of course, it is a large machlokes, but at least we hopefully have the basis of these halachas. And we'll continue with Simon Kuf Ayin Ches in the next year, B'siyata Dishmaya.